Somewhere around September 1925, a man died aboard a ship crossing the Atlantic. His name was James Deering. He was 65 years old, returning from Paris where doctors had failed to stop the infection spreading through his body. Behind him in Florida sat a 56-room palazzo that had consumed $15 million in 9 years of his life, roughly $400 million in today's currency. The house was designed to look like it had stood for 4 centuries. He had lived in it for 9. It sat on Biscayne Bay, clad entirely in marble and filled with furniture that had belonged to European aristocrats. Renaissance tapestries hanging on walls surrounding rooms that no family would ever occupy. Deering had never married. He had no children. His heirs did not want to live there. The palazzo, built to outlast empires, was already beginning its surrender to the subtropical wilderness that surrounded it. He had started with a mangrove swamp and a fortune made from mechanical grain harvesters. He ended with a Venetian villa containing fragments of a dozen dismantled European palaces, standing at the edge of a bay that would one day try to take it all back. Before we continue with what became of Deering's impossible dream, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments, and if you're interested in the darker corners of architectural history, the places where ambition and obsession built something beautiful and doomed, consider subscribing. The shoreline of Biscayne Bay had been inhabited for at least 2,000 years before James Deering arrived with his checkbook and his plans. The Tequesta people had fished these waters, built villages on the hammocks, and left shell mounds that would still be visible when the first developers arrived in the late 19th century. Spanish explorers reached the coast in 1513. They claimed the land, named it, and for the next 300 years left it largely alone. The heat was unbearable. The mosquitoes were worse. There were no roads, no cities, nothing that resembled European civilization except the occasional fort or mission that disease and isolation would eventually consume. By the time the United States acquired Florida in 1821, the southeastern tip of the peninsula remained what it had been for centuries, a tangle of mangroves and limestone hammocks, inhabited by Seminole people, alligators, and anyone desperate or ambitious enough to try farming in soil that yielded more rock than crops. Miami did not exist as a city until 1896. Its creation was the work of Henry Flagler, the Standard Oil partner who had built a railroad down the east coast of Florida and needed destinations to justify the expense. He extended the tracks to Biscayne Bay, built hotels, and declared that a city would follow. One did, but slowly. By 1912, Miami's population hovered around 5,000. The surrounding area, including the settlement called Coconut Grove just south of the new city, attracted a peculiar mix of pioneers, artists, and northern industrialists looking for winter warmth. The land itself remained raw. Coral limestone lay just beneath a thin layer of soil. Tropical hardwood hammocks grew dense along the bay. Mangroves choked the shoreline. This was not California. This was not the Mediterranean. This was a place where nature had to be beaten back daily, or it would reclaim every cleared acre within a season. In 1912, James Deering purchased 180 acres of this waterfront wilderness. The property sat south of Miami proper, facing Biscayne Bay with a view across the water toward the barrier islands that separated the bay from the Atlantic. There were no buildings on the land, no infrastructure, no indication that anyone had tried to tame it beyond the occasional cleared patch. Real estate speculators were already circling Miami. Sensing that Flagler's railroad had open territory ripe for transformation, but most of them were thinking in terms of hotels and subdivisions, Deering had something else in mind. He stood on 180 acres of rock and jungle with no roads and no visible reason why anyone would try to build a Venetian palazzo in a swamp. He had the land. He just needed someone to share his vision. James Deering had been born in South Paris, Maine on November 12, 1859, the son of a man who understood that American farms needed machines more than they needed extra hands. William Deering had founded the Deering Harvester Company in 1869, manufacturing mechanical grain reapers that allowed a single farmer to do the work of a dozen men. The business thrived. By the 1880s, Deering Harvester was one of the largest agricultural machinery manufacturers in the United States. competing directly with Cyrus McCormick's operation out of Chicago. James joined the family business as an executive, not an inventor. He managed operations, negotiated deals, and made himself indispensable to his father's empire without ever displaying the spark of mechanical genius that had built it. His brother Charles followed a similar path. The Deering sons were competent stewards of wealth they had not created, a common enough position among second-generation industrialists. But they were good at it. The transformation came in 1902. William Deering and his sons negotiated a merger between Deering Harvester McCormick Harvesting Machine Company and three smaller competitors to form International Harvester, one of the largest corporate consolidations in American history to that point. The deal made the Deering family approximately $60 million, equivalent to roughly $2 billion today. James became vice president of the new corporation. Charles took a board seat. By 1910, both brothers had semi-retired, wealthy enough to spend the rest of their lives doing whatever they wanted without ever diminishing the principle. James chose art. He had always been a collector, drawn to European culture with the intensity of someone who had grown up in industrial Chicago and never quite reconciled himself to it. By his early 50s, he was spending months at a time in Europe, buying paintings and antiques, attending auctions, and cultivating relationships with dealers who knew how to separate American millionaires from their money. Somewhere around 1910, he met Paul Chalfin. Chalfin was 36, a New York-born painter who had studied in Paris and worked as a curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. He had exquisite taste, absolute confidence in his own judgment, and an ego that required constant feeding. Deering gave him a job as artistic advisor. Within a year, Chalfin had become something closer to a partner, the person Deering consulted on every aesthetic decision, and the man who would eventually control nearly every aspect of the project that became Vizcaya. The relationship between the two men was close, possibly closer than the available records fully capture. Deering never married. He had no known romantic relationships with women. He lived as what people at the time called a confirmed bachelor, a term that often functioned as polite code for men who could not or would not marry. Chalfin was also unmarried. He would eventually spend months at a time living at Vizcaya as Deering's house guest, occupying rooms connected to Deering's private quarters by a corridor that the household staff referred to with careful neutrality. The evidence is circumstantial. The historical record is incomplete. But the pattern suggests a bond that went beyond professional collaboration, and the house they built together was designed from the beginning as a place for two people who had no intention of raising families or hosting the kind of social performances that other Gilded Age estates were built to accommodate. What drove Deering to build Vizcaya was not ambition or dynasty. It was time, or the lack of it. By 1912, he had been diagnosed with pernicious anemia, a condition that in the early 20th century was untreatable and fatal. The disease destroyed the body's ability to produce red blood cells. Patients grew progressively weaker, suffered neurological damage, and eventually died, usually within a few years of diagnosis. Deering's doctors recommended warm climates. Florida's subtropical winters were thought to be beneficial, or at least not harmful. Deering purchased the land in 1912 with the understanding that he was building a refuge where he could spend whatever time remained to him, surrounded by beauty, rather than dying slowly in a Chicago winter. He had the money, the land, and the knowledge that every decision felt urgent. Chalfin had the vision and the ego to match it. Together, they would attempt something that made no practical sense whatsoever. Paul Chalfin had studied painting in Paris and worked as a curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston before meeting Deering. But his real talent was not for making art. It was for spending other people's fortunes on it with a confidence that bordered on tyranny. Deering gave him nearly unlimited control. Chalfin would select the architect, approve every design decision, purchase every piece of furniture, and dictate the aesthetic philosophy that governed the entire project. The budget was functionally open-ended. The timeline was whatever it took. Deering wanted perfection. Chalfin promised to deliver it. The architect was Burrall Hoffman Jr., a 32-year-old Harvard graduate who had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and specialized in Mediterranean revival designs. Chalfin selected him, not Deering. Hoffman's role was to execute Chalfin's vision, not to impose his own. The power dynamic was explicit from the beginning. Chalfin made the decisions. Hoffman translated them into blueprints. When conflicts arose, Chalfin won. Hoffman would live to be 98 years old, outliving his patron by more than half a century, but Vizcaya would always be remembered as Chalfin's project, not his. The landscape architect was Diego Suarez, a Colombian-born designer who had trained in Italy and understood how to create gardens that looked like they had been tended for generations. Chalfin hired him to design 30 acres of formal Italian Renaissance gardens surrounding the main house. Gardens that would include fountains imported from Europe, sculpture collections arranged along stone pathways, and a layout of enclosed garden rooms separated by hedges and walls in the style of 16th-century Tuscan estates. Suarez's most ambitious design was the stone barge, a Baroque breakwater anchored in Biscayne Bay that functioned as both sculpture and wave barrier, carved from coral limestone and positioned to protect the house from storm surge while serving as a romantic folly visible from the main terraces. The design concept was straightforward in theory and nearly impossible in execution. Chalfin wanted a 16th-century Venetian villa, specifically modeled on villas along the Brenta River and the palazzos that lined the Grand Canal. He wanted rooms that looked like they had been furnished by Italian nobility over several generations. He wanted architectural fragments salvaged from actual European buildings incorporated into the structure, and he wanted the entire property to appear as though it had existed for centuries, weathered by time and mellowed by age, despite the fact that it was being built from scratch in a place with no architectural history beyond Seminole chickees and pioneer shacks. The philosophy had a name. Chalfin called it instant antiquity. The goal was not to build a new house. It was to construct a ruin that had somehow never actually fallen into ruin, a palazzo that looked ancient but functioned with 20th-century systems hidden behind period details. The name itself was chosen for its exotic European resonance. Vizcaya was a Basque word, referring to the province in northern Spain. It had no connection to Florida, no relationship to the property's history, and no meaning that anyone involved could clearly articulate beyond the fact that it sounded old world and vaguely aristocratic. That was enough. By the end of 1914, they had the plans, the team, and the conviction that a Venetian palazzo could rise from a Florida hammock and look like it had always been there. On Christmas Day, 1914, the first workers arrived. World War I was already 5 months old, and Europe was tearing itself apart. The workforce peaked at approximately 1,000 men, most of them Black Bahamian laborers, who lived in a temporary village that Deering built on the southern edge of the property. The village was substantial, a self-contained settlement with wooden barracks, a commissary, a post office, and recreation facilities designed to house workers who had traveled from the Bahamas for steady employment that was increasingly difficult to find in the Caribbean. Italian stone carvers arrived to handle the decorative work. Cuban artisans contributed tile and ironwork. European specialists were brought in for the interior finishing. The labor hierarchy was strict. White foremen and skilled craftsmen occupied the top positions. Black Bahamian workers provided the muscle for the hardest and most dangerous jobs, quarrying coral limestone on site, hauling materials, and pouring the concrete that formed the structure's hidden skeleton. The working conditions were brutal. South Florida in the summer meant temperatures above 90 degrees with suffocating humidity. Mosquitoes bred in standing water left by afternoon thunderstorms. Workers lived in basic camp housing while constructing a palace with gold-trimmed ceilings and imported marble floors. When the project was complete, Deering had the entire worker village dismantled and removed. No plaques commemorated the labor force. No records preserved the names of the men who had built Vizcaya. The only permanent structure was the palazzo itself, designed to look like it had been constructed by Italian craftsmen centuries earlier rather than by Caribbean immigrants working for daily wages. The materials came from everywhere. Coral limestone was quarried directly from the property, the ancient fossilized reef that formed the bedrock of South Florida, cut into blocks and shaped into walls. Cuban tile arrived by ship. Italian marble was imported despite the complications of World War I, which by 1917 had made transatlantic shipping dangerous and unpredictable. The structural frame was poured concrete, a thoroughly modern material that allowed for large open spaces and cantilevered balconies that would have been impossible with traditional masonry. The concrete was then clad in coral stone and stucco, disguised to look like load-bearing walls built centuries ago. Every modern system, electricity, plumbing, central vacuum, refrigeration, telephone lines, was hidden behind period-appropriate surfaces. Electric lights were housed in fixtures that resembled candelabras. Modern bathrooms were concealed behind carved wooden doors. The heating system was invisible. The effect was seamless. A visitor walking through Vizcaya in 1920 would have seen a Renaissance villa. They would not have seen the steel and concrete and electrical conduits that made it possible. The main house was sufficiently complete by December 1916 for Deering to take residence. The gardens were still under construction. The stone barge was years away from completion. Entire wings of the house remained unfinished. But Deering moved in, sleeping in a palazzo that was part construction site and part museum, and began what would be the shortest residence any Gilded Age industrialist would ever enjoy in a house that consumed that much money. While the workers in Florida were pouring concrete and carving coral stone, Paul Chalfin was crossing the Atlantic, walking through the townhouses of declining European aristocrats with a checkbook in his pocket and a list of rooms that needed filling. The timing was opportunistic in ways that no one involved seemed particularly troubled by. World War I had begun in August 1914, 6 months before construction started at Vizcaya. By 1917, much of Europe was starving. Aristocratic families who had maintained their estates for generations were liquidating assets to survive. Art dealers who had spent decades cultivating relationships with titled families suddenly found themselves handling estate sales that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Chalfin, with Deering's money behind him, moved through this collapsing world like a man at an auction where everything was for sale and no one else could afford to bid. He bought furniture that had belonged to Italian dukes, tapestries from French chateaux, Roman sculptures excavated from villa gardens, and entire architectural elements removed from buildings that were being demolished or abandoned. Ceilings were taken down, numbered, crated, and shipped to Florida. Doorways were extracted. Mantelpieces were pried loose. What Chalfin could not buy as original pieces, he commissioned as custom reproductions, hiring craftsmen to create furniture and decorative elements that matched period styles so precisely that distinguishing the antiques from the fakes became nearly impossible. The curatorial philosophy was not authenticity in the traditional sense. It was the creation of an environment where every object, whether 400 years old or 4 months old, contributed to the illusion of a house that had been furnished over centuries by families who had never existed. The rooms took shape around the objects. The Italian Renaissance living room was designed to accommodate a 16th century carved wooden ceiling that Chalfin had purchased from a villa outside Florence. The reception room featured a ceiling taken from a Venetian palazzo, its painted panels depicting mythological scenes that had once hung above the heads of actual Venetian nobility. The music room was finished in 18th century French Rococo style, with paneling acquired from a townhouse in Paris, and furniture upholstered in silk that matched the room's soft green and gold palette. The library was smaller, more intimate, designed as a gentleman's private study with carved wood paneling and a hidden door that opened into Deering's personal quarters. Each room was a period recreation so meticulous that museum curators would later struggle to determine which pieces were genuine antiques and which were modern fabrications made to complete the aesthetic. The ethics of the enterprise were complicated in ways that Deering and Chalfin seemed not to have considered worth examining. European culture was being preserved, certainly, but it was being preserved by removing it from Europe and installing it in a Florida estate where it would be seen by almost no one. The aristocratic families selling their possessions were doing so under duress, their fortunes gutted by war and social upheaval. The buildings being dismantled were part of Europe's architectural heritage, and Chalfin was stripping them for parts. But from Deering's perspective, he was rescuing art from destruction and giving it a home where it would be protected and maintained. The fact that the home was a private palazzo in a country that had no cultural connection to Renaissance Italy was not, in his view, a contradiction. It was the point. By 1922, the rooms were complete, the gardens were planted, and Vizcaya contained fragments of at least a dozen European buildings assembled into one Florida palazzo that had never existed anywhere before. The main house contained 70 rooms spread across 54,000 square feet of poured concrete disguised as 16th century masonry. The structure rose 3 stories above a basement level that housed service areas, mechanical systems, and an underground swimming pool designed to resemble a Roman bath grotto. The layout followed Italian villa principles, organized around a central open-air courtyard paved with Cuban tile and centered on an ancient wellhead that Chalfin had acquired in Italy. Rooms radiated outward from the courtyard, each opening onto terraces or loggias that blurred the boundary between interior and exterior space in a way that made sense in Mediterranean climates but required constant maintenance in South Florida's punishing humidity. The East Loggia was the house's signature space, a covered terrace facing Biscayne Bay with coral stone arches, framing views of the water and the stone barge beyond. The grand staircase, carved from pink and beige marble and rising through the center of the entrance hall, had cost $2 million alone, roughly $50 million in current dollars. The ceilings throughout the main floor were trimmed in 24-karat gold leaf. 16 fireplaces, most of them decorative rather than functional, were installed in rooms where fires were rarely needed. The technology was everywhere and nowhere. A central vacuum system operated through outlets hidden in baseboards. Telephones were concealed in cabinets. Electric lights were disguised as candles or chandeliers that looked like they burned oil. Modern bathrooms featured toilets and plumbing hidden behind carved wooden enclosures that opened to reveal sinks with brass fixtures and tile work imported from Europe. The underground swimming pool, accessible by a staircase from the courtyard, was lined with tile and lit by skylights, a luxury that most Florida residents in the 1920s could not have imagined, and that most of Deering's guests would never see. The stone barge sat 150 feet offshore, a Baroque fantasy of carved limestone rising from Biscayne Bay like something that had drifted loose from a Venetian canal and run aground in the wrong hemisphere. Suarez had designed it as both sculpture and seawall, a breakwater that would absorb wave energy during storms while serving as a visual focal point for the terraces and gardens. Stone figures reclined along the upper balustrades. Staircases descended to platforms where boats could tie up. The entire structure was carved from coral limestone and positioned with enough engineering precision to survive decades of hurricanes, at least until the storms grew strong enough to overwhelm anything built by human hands. The gardens covered 30 acres, divided into a series of enclosed rooms separated by walls, hedges, and carefully managed sightlines. Suarez had studied Italian Renaissance garden design, and he recreated it faithfully, building a landscape that imposed geometric order on the tropical wilderness surrounding it. Fountains imported from Italy anchored key intersections. Sculptures, some ancient and some modern reproductions, were positioned along pathways and in alcoves. A maze garden challenged visitors to navigate its hedges. A secret garden, enclosed by walls and accessible only through a single gate, provided a contemplative space away from the main terraces. Every plant was chosen for its ability to survive Florida's climate while maintaining the appearance of a Mediterranean landscape. Native vegetation was removed or pushed to the property's edges, held back by constant labor, a civilized European garden imposed on a tropical hammock through sheer force of will and maintenance budget. Deering's bedroom was surprisingly modest compared to the public spaces. It occupied the second floor of the east wing, furnished with period pieces but lacking the grandeur of the living areas below. The room connected to a private corridor that led to other second-floor bedrooms, including the suite that Chalfin occupied during his extended stays. The household staff understood the layout. They kept the corridor clean, maintained the rooms, and did not comment on who slept where or how the private quarters were used. It had taken 8 years and $15 million, roughly $400 million in current dollars, to build. Deering had created the most expensive winter house in Florida, and he would live in it alone. James Deering spent his winters at Vizcaya from December through April, and the rest of the year the house sat mostly empty, its 50 staff members maintaining rooms that no one occupied and gardens that no one walked through. The seasonal pattern was typical for wealthy Northerners who owned Florida properties, but the scale of the operation required to keep Vizcaya running was extraordinary even by Gilded Age standards. The staff included butlers, maids, cooks, gardeners, chauffeurs, and farm workers who tended the small agricultural operation that Deering had established on the southern portion of the property. The hierarchy was rigid. White household managers oversaw Black and Bahamian service workers who handled the daily labor of cleaning, cooking, and maintaining grounds that required constant attention to prevent the jungle from reclaiming what had been cleared. Deering's daily routine was quiet, almost monastic. He took breakfast in the courtyard or on the east loggia, depending on weather. Mornings were spent in the gardens or the library, reading or managing correspondence related to international harvester business that he still nominally oversaw as a board member. Lunch was light. Afternoons often included a car ride through Coconut Grove or along the new roads being built through Miami as the city expanded. Dinners were small, intimate affairs, usually just Deering and Chalfin, occasionally joined by Deering's brother Charles and Charles's family, who lived nearby and visited frequently. The estate had been designed to accommodate large social gatherings, but Deering rarely hosted them. He preferred small circles, quiet conversations, and long stretches of time where the only sounds were the fountains in the courtyard and the waves breaking against the stone barge. This was not Hearst Castle. This was not Biltmore. Vizcaya was not built to impress hundreds of weekend guests or to host the kind of lavish parties that other Gilded Age industrialists staged as demonstrations of their wealth and social power. It was a contemplative retreat, a place designed for two people who valued beauty and privacy above spectacle. William Jennings Bryan visited and commented on the gardens. Business associates from International Harvester came through occasionally, touring the house and marveling at the expense. Artists and cultural figures from New York stopped by when they were wintering in Florida. But the guest lists were short, and the events were modest. Vizcaya was not a stage. It was a sanctuary. Built by a man who knew he was dying and wanted to spend his final years surrounded by art rather than commerce. Chalfin's presence was constant. He lived at Vizcaya for months at a time, occupying rooms connected to Deering's private quarters by the corridor that the staff maintained with discreet professionalism. When Chalfin was away on buying trips or managing his affairs in New York, Deering wrote to him frequently, letters that discussed art acquisitions, garden maintenance, and the minor adjustments that Vizcaya required as it settled into its role as a lived-in estate rather than a construction project. The relationship was the axis around which the entire property turned. Deering had the money and the vision. Chalfin had the taste and the will to execute it. Together they had created something that neither man could have built alone, a palazzo that made no practical sense and served no purpose beyond its own existence. The working farm on the southern portion of the property provided vegetables, dairy, and eggs, a gesture toward self-sufficiency that was more symbolic than necessary for a man who could afford to import anything he wanted. The boat dock on the bay allowed access by water, a romantic concession to the estate's waterfront setting, and a practical necessity in an era when roads through Coconut Grove were still unpaved and subject to flooding. The entire operation was designed to function as a European estate transplanted intact to Florida, a world unto itself where the owner never had to leave the grounds unless he chose to, and where everything from the marble floors to the garden vegetables existed to support a lifestyle that was already vanishing even as Vizcaya was being completed. Deering's health had been declining since the estate was finished, and by 1925 he knew he did not have much time left. In September he sailed to Paris seeking treatment. He never made it home. James Deering died aboard ship on September 21, 1925, 5 days before his 66th birthday. Returning from Paris, where doctors had been unable to do anything for the infection that was shutting down his organs. His body was returned to Chicago for burial, the estate, its furnishings, and the fortune that remained passed to his heirs, the children of his brother Charles. The group included Marion Deering McCormick and her siblings, none of whom had ever lived at Vizcaya and none of whom had any intention of starting. The inheritance created an immediate problem. Annual maintenance costs ran above $100,000 in 1920s currency, equivalent to roughly $1.8 million today. The staff had to be paid. The gardens required constant work. The house itself, built in a climate that rotted wood and corroded metal with relentless efficiency, needed ongoing repairs that could not be deferred without risking serious damage. The heirs had inherited a palace they could not afford to maintain and could not sell for anything approaching its construction cost. The 1926 hurricane arrived on September 18th, 1 year and 3 days after Deering's death. It was a Category 4 storm with sustained winds of 150 miles per hour, the first major hurricane to hit Miami since the city had grown into something worth destroying. The storm surge from Biscayne Bay flooded Vizcaya's first floor. Water poured through windows and doorways, soaking floors, damaging furniture, and destroying sections of the gardens that Suarez had spent years perfecting. The stone barge was partially demolished, its carved figures toppled, and its structural integrity compromised. Roof tiles were ripped loose, tree branches smashed through windows. When the water receded, the heirs were left with a damaged property and repair costs that they could not afford, on top of the maintenance budget they were already struggling to meet. They did what they could. Staff numbers were reduced, rooms were closed off. Furniture was covered with sheets and left in place while the family decided what to do. The gardens, which required daily attention to prevent the subtropical vegetation from overwhelming them, began to deteriorate. Hedges grew wild, fountains stopped flowing, pathways cracked, and weeds pushed through. Some damage from the hurricane was repaired. Much of it was not. Vizcaya entered a period of managed decline, kept barely alive by a family that understood its historical value but lacked the resources or the will to restore it to its original condition. The palazzo that had been designed to appear centuries old was beginning to look genuinely abandoned. The stock market crash of 1929 arrived 3 years later. The Depression turned Vizcaya from an expensive burden into an impossible one. The Deering heirs, like most American families with significant wealth tied to investments and industrial holdings, saw their fortunes contract sharply. International Harvester's stock price collapsed. Dividend income dried up. The money that might have been used to maintain Vizcaya evaporated, and the estate slid further into disrepair. Through the 1930s, the staff was cut to a skeleton crew responsible for basic security and minimal upkeep. Entire wings of the house were abandoned. Rooms that had once been showpieces became storage areas or were simply locked and left. The gardens, which had required a team of gardeners working full-time, were reduced to periodic mowing of the main lawns, while the elaborate plantings and ornamental features were left to survive or die on their own. No member of the Deering family lived at Vizcaya during these years. The house was maintained in a state of preservation limbo, not quite abandoned, but far from the manicured perfection that Deering and Chalfin had insisted upon. Visitors were rare. The property generated no income. It simply sat, a monument to wealth that no longer existed, consuming money that the heirs no longer had. World War II brought further complications. Materials needed for repairs were diverted to the war effort. Labor was scarce. Gas rationing made it difficult to travel to the property even for basic maintenance checks. By 1945, the heirs faced a decision that had been building for 2 decades. They could not afford to maintain 180 acres. They could barely afford to maintain the house itself. In 1945, they sold 130 of the original 180 acres to developers. The land was subdivided and developed into Vizcaya Terrace, an apartment complex, along with commercial properties that generated immediate cash and ongoing income through ground leases. The sale was a calculated retreat, trading most of the estate's acreage for money that could be used to maintain the core 50 acres surrounding the main house and gardens. It was not enough. Even with the reduced footprint, the costs remained prohibitive. The house was too large. The gardens were too elaborate. The mechanical systems required constant attention, and the heirs, who had never wanted the property in the first place, were running out of patience. By the late 1940s, they began approaching Miami-Dade County about a possible donation or sale. The pitch was straightforward. The county would take ownership of Vizcaya, convert it into a public museum, and assume responsibility for maintenance and operations. In exchange, the public would gain access to one of Florida's most significant architectural landmarks, and the heirs would be released from an obligation that had become financially and emotionally exhausting. The county was hesitant. Vizcaya's maintenance costs were well known. Taking ownership meant committing taxpayer money to preserve a palace built by an industrialist who had no connection to Miami beyond choosing its climate as a winter refuge. Negotiations dragged on for 7 years, during which time the alternative became increasingly clear. If the county did not accept the property, the heirs would sell the remaining 50 acres to developers, demolish the house, and walk away. Vizcaya came within years of being destroyed entirely. Preservationists mobilized. Local historians, architects, and cultural leaders argued that Vizcaya represented an irreplaceable piece of Florida's history, a connection to the Gilded Age, and a rare example of Mediterranean revival architecture executed at the highest level. Newspaper editorials supported preservation. Civic groups pressured county commissioners. The argument that eventually won was not primarily about aesthetics or history, it was about tourism. Miami was growing rapidly. The county needed attractions that would draw visitors and distinguish the area from other Florida destinations. A museum showcasing European art and architecture might do that, especially if it could be marketed as a unique cultural experience unavailable anywhere else in the state. In 1952, after 7 years of negotiations and mounting pressure from preservationists who understood that Miami was about to lose something irreplaceable, Miami-Dade County agreed to accept the property. The palazzo would survive, but it would never again be what Deering had intended. Vizcaya Museum and Gardens opened to the public in 1952 with a mission that would have baffled James Deering: to preserve his private retreat by inviting thousands of strangers to walk through it. The transformation was immediate and jarring. Rooms that had been occupied by one man and his house guest were now toured by school groups and tourists. The courtyard that Deering had used for quiet breakfasts became a throughway for visitors shuffling from room to room. The gardens, designed as contemplative spaces, were open to anyone willing to pay the admission fee. The county hired curators to manage the collection, groundskeepers to maintain the landscape, and docents to lead tours that explained the house's history without dwelling too long on the questions that might complicate the narrative. Who had built it? What had it cost? Why had it been abandoned? The initial years focused on basic preservation. Rooms were restored to approximate their 1916 appearance using photographs and inventories that Chalfin had created. Missing furniture was replaced with period-appropriate pieces. Gardens were replanted according to Suarez's original designs, though budget constraints meant that the elaborate maintenance routines of Deering's era were scaled back significantly. The house was stabilized. Leaks were repaired. Mechanical systems were updated. By 1970, Vizcaya was added to the U.S. National Register of Historic Places, a designation that provided federal recognition but little additional funding. In 1994, it was elevated to National Historic Landmark status, the highest level of recognition for a property of national significance. The financial model that emerged relied on multiple revenue streams. Admission fees provided baseline income. Private events, including weddings and corporate functions, generated significant revenue but sparked ongoing debates about whether hosting contemporary events in historic spaces was appropriate or exploitative. Grants from preservation organizations, philanthropic donations, and county funding covered the gaps. Annual maintenance costs by the early 2000s had climbed to approximately $3 million to $4 million, and that figure did not include major restoration projects or capital improvements. Visitor numbers remained strong, typically between 200,000 and 300,000 people per year. Enough to sustain operations, but not enough to build substantial reserves for emergencies. Hurricane Andrew provided the first test of the museum's resilience. On August 24, 1992, a Category 5 storm made landfall south of Miami with sustained winds of 165 miles per hour. Vizcaya, located north of the storm's path, avoided the worst of the damage, but the gardens were devastated. Trees were uprooted, hedges were shredded, ornamental features were destroyed. The stone barge, already weakened by decades of wave action and salt exposure, sustained additional damage. A major restoration campaign followed, funded by insurance payouts, federal disaster relief, and private donations. The gardens were replanted. Structural damage was repaired. By the late 1990s, Vizcaya had recovered enough to launch its most ambitious project since opening as a museum, a $14 million comprehensive restoration of the main house that addressed decades of deferred maintenance, updated climate control systems, and conserved original furnishings that were deteriorating under the stress of humidity and public access. In 1998, the Vizcaya Museum and Gardens Trust was established as a nonprofit organization to manage the property in partnership with Miami-Dade County. The trust took over daily operations, fundraising, and programming, while the county retained ownership and provided baseline funding. The arrangement allowed for more aggressive fundraising and greater operational flexibility. The trust expanded educational programs, established artist residencies, launched concert series in the gardens, and began positioning Vizcaya as more than a house museum, as a cultural institution that could host contemporary art installations and performances while preserving the historical integrity of the buildings and landscape. The early 2000s brought restoration of the stone barge, a multi-year project that stabilized the structure and replaced carved elements that had been destroyed or were too damaged to save. The preservation philosophy emphasized returning Vizcaya to its 1916 state wherever possible, conserving original materials and making reversible interventions that future preservationists could undo if better techniques became available. Museum staff worked with conservation specialists to stabilize paintings, treat furniture, and monitor environmental conditions that could accelerate deterioration. The challenge was constant. South Florida's heat and humidity were relentless. Salt air corroded metal. Mold grew on organic materials. Insects attacked wood. Every surface required ongoing attention, and the costs never stopped climbing. By 2017, Vizcaya had survived the Depression, World War II, the death of its creator, 2 major hurricanes, and 65 years of public use, but the threat that would come next was something no one could have anticipated when Deering chose his waterfront site a century earlier. Hurricane Irma made landfall in South Florida on September 10, 2017, as a Category 4 storm with sustained winds of 130 miles per hour and a storm surge that turned Biscayne Bay into a battering ram. The water rose 4 feet above normal levels, pouring over the seawalls and flooding Vizcaya's entire first floor. Waves broke through windows on the East Loggia. The courtyard filled like a swimming pool. Water surged through the reception rooms, the living room, the dining room, soaking into wooden floors and climbing the legs of furniture that had survived a century, only to be submerged in salt water, contaminated with bay sediment and debris. The electrical systems failed. Emergency lighting went dark. When the storm passed and the water receded, staff members wading through the first floor in rubber boots found priceless antiques floating, tapestries hanging heavy with water, and floors buckled beyond repair. The damage estimate came to more than $20 million. The museum closed immediately. Emergency stabilization began within days, crews working to remove standing water, dry out interiors, and prevent mold from spreading through organic materials. Furniture was removed to climate-controlled storage. Tapestries were frozen to halt deterioration until conservators could assess each piece individually. Floors were torn up. Wall surfaces were removed to expose structural elements that needed drying. The restoration would take years. The museum launched a $45 million capital campaign combining hurricane recovery with climate resilience improvements, recognizing that Irma was not an anomaly, but a preview of what was coming. The larger threat was already here. Climate change and sea level rise were no longer abstract future concerns. They were present realities. Vizcaya sits at sea level on Biscayne Bay in Miami-Dade County, one of the most vulnerable metropolitan areas in the United States to sea level rise. Current projections suggest that by 2100, if not sooner, sea levels in South Florida could rise by multiple feet. Storm surges during hurricanes will be higher. King tides, which already flood streets in Miami Beach during full moons, will become more frequent and more severe. The bay that Deering chose for its romantic views and its connection to Venetian waterfront villas is now the mechanism through which nature will reclaim what was built. Engineering studies commissioned by the Trust examined options for protecting Vizcaya. Conventional seawalls would block the views that are central to the estate's design. Living shorelines using mangroves and oyster reefs could absorb wave energy, but would take decades to establish and might not withstand major storms. Elevating infrastructure, raising mechanical systems above flood levels, and installing pumps and flood barriers would cost tens of millions of dollars and would require ongoing upgrades as sea levels continued rising. The most comprehensive protection scenario, combining multiple strategies into a layered defense system, carried a price tag estimated between $50 million and $100 million, with no guarantee of long-term success. The question was not whether Vizcaya could be protected indefinitely. It was how long the protection would hold before the water overwhelmed it. By 2024, the museum had partially reopened. Some rooms on the first floor remained closed, undergoing restoration that would extend into the following years. The gardens, though damaged, had recovered better than the house, their plantings more resilient to flooding than the interior furnishings and finishes. Climate adaptation planning continued, but the fundamental problem had no solution that did not involve either accepting eventual loss or spending amounts of money that were difficult to justify for a single property, no matter how significant. Every dollar spent on protection was a dollar that would eventually be overwhelmed by forces that no seawall or barrier system could hold back forever. The question that James Deering never had to answer, the question that his heirs avoided by giving it away, now falls to Miami-Dade County and everyone who believes Vizcaya is worth saving. How do you preserve a palace built at sea level when the sea is coming to take it back? Deering spent his last years importing European civilization into a Florida wilderness, assembling fragments of a culture that was not his own and installing them in a landscape that had no connection to the aesthetic he was pursuing. He wanted beauty. He wanted perfection. He wanted time to stop, or at least to slow down enough that he could inhabit a space where the industrial world he had profited from could be shut out entirely. He got 9 years. The house he built contained rooms furnished with antiques purchased from families whose fortunes had collapsed during a war that was destroying the continent he was trying to recreate. The gardens imposed geometric European order on a subtropical ecosystem that required constant violence to prevent it from reasserting itself. The 1,000 workers who built Vizcaya left no mark beyond the structure itself, and that structure was designed to look like it had been built by someone else, somewhere else, centuries earlier. What are we preserving? The question does not have a simple answer. Vizcaya is undeniably beautiful. It contains museum-quality art and architectural fragments that would be difficult to replace. It represents a moment in American history when industrialists had the wealth and the audacity to build private palaces that rivaled European estates, and when the assumptions that allowed such projects seemed unshakable. It is also a monument to extraction, to cultural appropriation, to labor exploitation, and to an aesthetic philosophy that valued the appearance of age over the reality of place. The Black Bahamian workers who quarried the limestone and poured the concrete deserved better than erasure. The European families who sold their possessions under duress deserved better than to have their heritage transplanted into a Florida palazzo as decorative elements in someone else's fantasy. The Tequesta people who inhabited Biscayne Bay for 2,000 years before Deering arrived deserved acknowledgement beyond a passing mention in the story of a white industrialist's vanity project. Vizcaya is still open. Visitors still walk through the rooms and gardens. Weddings are still held on the terraces overlooking the bay. The museum staff works tirelessly to maintain what Deering built, knowing that every hurricane season brings the possibility of another Irma, and that every year without a major storm is borrowed time. Climate adaptation planning continues. Fundraising campaigns target donors who believe that preserving Vizcaya is worth the cost, even as the cost keeps rising and the timeline for effective protection keeps shortening. The palazzo that Deering designed to appear as though it had stood for centuries will be fortunate to survive another 50 years in its current location, and everyone involved knows it. James Deering would not recognize what his estate has become. The privacy is gone. The exclusivity is gone. The quiet mornings in the courtyard and the intimate dinners with Paul Chalfin are gone. What remains is a public institution struggling to preserve a private dream that was never sustainable, built in a location that is increasingly untenable, maintained by a commitment to historical preservation that requires more faith than funding. The irony that Deering built on the waterfront because it was beautiful, because Venetian villas sat on water, and because the view across Biscayne Bay reminded him of the Grand Canal, has become the existential threat that will eventually destroy what he created. The stone barge is still there, carved figures staring at the water that rises imperceptibly higher each year, holding back waves that one day will be too much for even Baroque sculpture to stop.